The story of Esther begins in Susa, during the reign of King Xerxes, Ahasuerus. He holds a magnificent banquet, full of luxury and extravagance. Esther 1 verses 1-8. At the height of the feast, he commands Queen Vashti to appear and display her beauty before the guests. But Vashti refuses. Furious, the king removes her from her royal position. A decree is issued throughout the empire. Vashti would never again appear before the king. It may sound like just a historical detail, but here we already learn something profound. Choices have consequences. With a single decision, Vashti lost her crown and opened the way for someone else to rise. And here is the lesson. One decision can change your entire story. How many times have we made choices driven by pride, anger, or haste, and lost opportunities we may never recover? Ask yourself, have I been making wise decisions or allowing momentary emotions to determine my destiny? After Vashti's fall, the king commands that young women be brought to the palace so a new queen can be chosen. Esther 2 verses 1-4. Among them is Hadassah, known as Esther, a young Jewish woman raised by her cousin Mordecai. Esther is taken to the royal harem and undergoes months of preparation. She stands out not only for her beauty but also for her humility and grace. When her turn comes, she wins the king's favor, and he crowns her as queen. Esther 2 verse 17. Think about it. An orphan, a foreigner, unknown to the empire, now becomes the most influential woman in Persia. And here is the lesson. It doesn't matter where you came from. What matters is where God can take you. Perhaps you feel small, without influence, without resources. But the same God who lifted Esther can lift you into places you never imagined. Ask yourself, am I trusting more in my limitations than in God's power? Or am I willing to believe He can position me strategically for His purpose? A man named Haman, elevated to a position of high authority by King Xerxes, begins to demand reverence from everyone. All bow before him, except Mordecai the Jew. Esther 3 verses 1-2. Haman's anger is not limited to Mordecai. He plots to destroy the entire Jewish people. A decree is signed, setting the day for their massacre. Esther 3 verses 8-15. Imagine the weight of that decree, an entire people marked for death. The Jews mourn, fast, and cry out to God. Here is the lesson. Faithfulness to God will always be tested. Mordecai refused to bow before Haman because he knew he owed worship only to God. That stance brought persecution, but it also opened the door for God's intervention. Ask yourself, how many times have I bowed to the pressures of this world just to avoid problems? Do I have the courage to remain faithful even when it may cost me dearly? When Mordecai hears of the decree, he tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth and ashes, and weeps publicly. Esther 4 verse 1. He sends a message to Esther, "Do not think that because you are in the king's house you alone of all the Jews will escape. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Esther 4 verses 13-14. Those words echo through history. Esther was comfortable in the palace. She could have tried to stay silent. But her position was not for her own benefit, it was for a greater purpose. Her response is remarkable. "Go, gather all the Jews. Fast for me. I will go to the king even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Esther 4 verse 16. What courage! What surrender! She understood her life had a greater purpose than her own safety. Here is the lesson. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is acting in spite of fear. Esther reminds us that God often places us in strategic positions not for comfort, but for His plan. Ask yourself, am I living only for my comfort or am I willing to risk for something greater? Could it be that I was placed where I am for such a time as this? After the fast, Esther gathers her courage and enters the inner court of the palace, risking her life. The king could have ordered her death, but when he sees her, he extends his golden scepter. Esther 5 verses 1-2. She is received with favor. With wisdom, Esther does not immediately ask for her people's deliverance. Instead, she invites the king and Haman to a banquet. At that banquet, she invites them to yet another banquet, Esther 5 verses 4 to 8. Notice, Esther does not act impulsively. She prays, fasts, waits for the right time, and acts with strategy. Here is the lesson. Victory does not come only from courage but also from wisdom. How many times, driven by anxiety, have we spoken too soon and lost opportunities? Esther shows us that courage must walk hand in hand with patience and discernment. Ask yourself, am I seeking wisdom before acting, or am I moving only by emotion in the moment? While Haman is plotting to hang Mordecai, something incredible happens. That very night the king cannot sleep. He asks for the royal records to be read and discovers that Mordecai once saved his life but was never honored, Esther 6 verses 1 to 3. The king decides to rectify this immediately. Ironically, Haman himself is ordered to honor Mordecai, parading him through the streets on a royal horse, proclaiming his greatness, Esther 6 verses 10 to 11. What a reversal. The man who planned Mordecai's death is forced to exalt him publicly. Here is the lesson. When God decides to act, no one can stop him. Even while enemies are plotting against you, God can turn the situation around in a single night. Ask yourself, do I trust that God is in control even when everything looks lost? At the second banquet, the king again asks Esther what her request is. With courage, she reveals her identity and exposes the conspiracy. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. Esther 7 verse 4. The king enraged asks, who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing? Esther points and says, the adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. Esther 7 verse 6. Terrified, Haman is condemned and hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai, Esther 7 verse 10. What divine irony! The enemy who planned destruction was destroyed by his own trap. Here is the lesson. Evil always digs its own grave. It may look for a time like wicked plans are succeeding, but at the right moment, God exposes the truth and brings justice. Ask yourself, do I believe that God is just enough to defend my cause, or have I been trying to take justice into my own hands? Even though Haman was dead, the decree against the Jews was still in effect. Esther once again goes before the king, pleading for her people. The king authorizes Mordecai to issue a new decree. The Jews could defend themselves on the appointed day, Esther 8 verse 11. And so it happened. The people who were marked for destruction now had permission to resist and prevail. Fear turned into courage. Shame turned into honor. Here is the lesson. When God is with us, what was once a death sentence becomes an opportunity for victory. God not only removes the enemy but also equips his people to fight and win. Ask yourself, have I been standing firm with the weapons God has given me, or have I surrendered to fear in the face of life's decrees? The appointed day arrives. The enemies of the Jews rise to attack them, but something unexpected happens. The fear of God falls on all the provinces, and even the royal officials support the Jews, Esther 9 verses 1 to 3. The Jews prevail over their enemies. The day that was meant for mourning becomes a day of joy, victory, and honor. For this reason, Mordecai establishes the Feast of Purim, so that generations would remember how God turned sorrow into celebration. Esther 9 verses 20 to 22. Here is the lesson. God specializes in turning days of defeat into days of victory. What seemed like the end can become a new beginning. The day marked for destruction can be remembered as the day you experienced God's deliverance. Ask yourself, do I have faith to believe that God can turn my mourning into dancing? The book ends by highlighting Mordecai, now honored as second in command under the king. He worked for the good of his people and spoke up for their welfare, Esther 10 verse 3. What a reversal! The man who once refused to bow to Haman is now exalted before the entire empire. Here is the lesson. Faithfulness to God may bring opposition at first, but in the end it leads to honor. Mordecai is remembered because he never compromised his principles. Ask yourself, am I willing to remain faithful even when it costs me now, so that I may receive the honor that comes from God later? The story of Esther is not only about a queen who saved her people. It is about a God who raises ordinary people in extraordinary times. It is about courage in the midst of fear. It is about faithfulness in the midst of pressure. It is about a purpose greater than our own comfort. And maybe God is saying to you today, just as Mordecai said to Esther, back-end index pointing right, and who knows but that you have come to your position for such a time as this? So let me ask you, are you willing to trust God even when you don't understand the process? Do you believe He can turn decrees of death into opportunities for life? Do you believe He can turn mourning into celebration, shame into honor, defeat into victory? Because the same God who wrote Esther's story is also writing yours.